Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining this pre-COP26 briefing and preview of the VCMI roadmap hosted by the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. I am Mark Jacobs, a member of the VCMI Secretariat staff located at Meridian Institute. We're delighted that so many of you have chosen to join in today. We welcome participants from a wide range of sectors and perspectives, as well as geographies. We appreciate everyone's interest in the work of VCMI. Some of you have been following VCMI since the spring and may have anticipated and participated in prior events or consultation processes. Others of you may be new to VCMI. We'll be seeking to quickly bring everyone up to speed on VCMI's efforts to date, review the input we have received from stakeholders, and focus most of our time on where VCMI, informed by our extensive consultative processes, is headed, and the issues on which VCMI will focus. The overarching goal of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative is to produce corporate claims guidance on high ambition voluntary use of carbon credits, emphasizing not only contributions to greenhouse gas mitigation, but also the vital social and environmental co-benefits that investments in carbon credits can support. We also are working with partners at UNDP and Climate Focus to support countries in developing VCM access strategies. Finally, VCMI recognizes that an insurance framework and institutional infrastructure is an essential component of this work. You will learn more about all of this shortly. From its inception, VCMI has welcomed broad stakeholder participation, and we will continue to seek engagement throughout the process of developing claims guidance. We are eager to understand the issues that most concern you, as well as how you might like to engage with VCMI moving forward. Please complete the form linked in the chat momentarily, and also linked in the email that you received yesterday. I will now take a couple of minutes to review our agenda for today and introduce our presenters all at once so that we can avoid interrupting the flow of the presentations. We will start with an overview of the high-level VCMI vision presented by Angela Churier-Kalhauga, who co-chair of the Expert Advisory Committee of the VCMI. Angela heads the Secretariat of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition for the World Bank, an initiative that brings together stakeholders from government, business, civil society, and academia from across the world to advocate and work to put a price on carbon. She has over 2 decades of experience working on climate change, energy, and development issues in government, academia, and civil society in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Angela's presentation will then be followed by 3 components on VCMI's work to date and roadmap forward. First, Lori Restino, Co-Executive Director of VCMI, will review key milestones in VCMI's first phase, including a high-level summary of the feedback we received on the VCMI consultation report. A full report of this feedback will be released at the COP. Lori is currently responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the Secretariat. She served for many years as senior counsel at the United States Department of Agriculture in Washington, advising on environmental and sustainable agriculture matters. After federal service, Lori was appointed as law professor and director of a Sustainable Food System Center at Vermont Law School. She currently teaches environmental policy and global food system sustainability at Johns Hopkins. Mark Kenber, who serves as the other co-executive director for external affairs of the VCMI Secretariat, will then present on VCMI's roadmap, including goals and key activities moving forward. This roadmap will also be released at the COP. Mark is based in the UK and is Managing Director of Climate Advisors. He has worked on environment, climate, and energy issues for over 2 decades in government, NGOs, and the private sector. With a background in development and environmental economics, Mark has worked across various areas at the intersection of environmental and climate policy and business and economics. We'll conclude with a presentation of the key substantive issues on which VCMI is focusing as we move forward, which are also included in the roadmap. This will be presented by Kelly Kazier, who, along with Angela, is co-chair of VCMI's Expert Advisory Group. Kelly serves as Vice President for Global Climate at Environmental Defense Fund. She brings vast experience in global climate policy and multilateral forums. She has extensive experience advocating for ambitious climate policy and has deep expertise in the design, performance, accounting, and transparency of international carbon markets. We are indeed very grateful to have such an experienced and talented team at the helm of VCMI. All of the presenters will remain as a panel after the presentation to address your questions and exchange perspectives. Throughout the presentations, we invite you to use the Q&A feature to submit questions for our panel. You're welcome to ask a question of a particular panelist. You can indicate that, or a panel as the whole. You can ask a question by selecting the icon from the ribbon at the bottom of the Zoom window. After the presentations have concluded, I will call on participants to ask the questions they have posted in the Q&A. Our meeting is scheduled for 90 minutes. We'll adjourn early if we answer all the questions that you all have. And in the event that we don't get through all the questions in the time we have, we will endeavor to reach out to you to respond to outstanding questions. So with that, we'll get started with our presentation, and I will turn it over to Angela.
So good morning and good afternoon to all of you who have taken the time to join us today. So in the last year, we've seen a heightened attention to voluntary carbon markets. We've seen more and more companies and other non-state actors, whether it's at the national or subnational levels, setting ambitious targets. Now, as they further define their strategies to meet these targets, the role of carbon pricing, and in particular, the voluntary carbon market, is now taking central stage. Now, provided that the carbon credits generated by these markets are high quality, voluntary carbon markets can provide an opportunity to channel significant private sector finance into mitigating climate change, into protecting the environment and supporting sustainable livelihoods around the world. At the same time, at a time when we really need investment and finance. But as we know, in the absence of agreed global guidance and standards, integrity concerns will remain. Integrity is crucial to ensure that the use of voluntary carbon markets strengthens rather than undermines global action towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So the VCMI was set up to bring together stakeholders to develop a shared vision for how to ensure high integrity in the use of carbon credits for voluntary purposes, with a view to ensuring that these markets, voluntary markets, strengthen rather than undermine global action, and also contribute to sustainable development. Fulfilling this vision would enable increased mitigation of greenhouse gases by accelerating investments into reductions and removals. It would see more financing being channeled to climate action, especially in developing countries, thus enabling the achievement of their climate strategies as have been embodied in the NDCs. And furthermore, a credible voluntary carbon market would make important contributions to sustainable development by generating and sharing benefits more equitably. Other outcomes will include the possibility to increase contributions of non-state actors to global climate action, increasing their ambition beyond what their existing obligations may be. It could contribute to innovation and knowledge sharing, and ultimately would be a very important complement to international cooperation under the Paris Agreement, Article 6. So for us to realize this vision, we require deep collaboration among all stakeholders from the public, private sector, as well as civil society. And this indeed is what the VCMI sets out to do. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Angela. We'll now turn to Lori Rustino.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to go over our beginning, the consultation organization of VCMI, to give some background about where we have been, and then we'll be talking about where we're going. So our inception phase started last spring when we started a consultation process with multiple stakeholder groups and engagement to really figure out what were the needs in this space for voluntary carbon markets governance, reaching out to businesses, civil society, indigenous peoples and local communities. Then we developed a report, a consultation report, which you can find on our website. That was released in July of 29. Then we went through another really a shorter kind of feedback process where we asked for feedback from anybody who wanted to give us feedback on that report and some of our findings, some of our initial thoughts about what guidance might include, and some other issues that we also found are important, including access strategies, especially for countries from the global south, and then an overarching lens of equity. So we put all those forth in that report and asked for comments over about a month-long period. And in fact, we'll be releasing a follow-up to that at the end of this week. So you can find that report on our website, as I noted. And again, we will be providing kind of a report on what the feedback was for that. During the August period after our launch on July 29th, what we did was we set up our internal governance. So the Secretariat is really the administrative backbone of VCMI. That's me and Mark and others on this call. That is provided really by the Meridian Institute. And then what we also did was we set up the steering committee. The steering committee is really the highest decision-making body within VCMI, as well as other important groups that will be providing both the background and the advice to the steering committee in terms of claims guidance, access strategies, including the expert advisory group, which is comprised of really experts from across the globe on carbon markets. We also have a country contact group, which is convened with the cooperation of the UK government as well as of the UNDP. We're very thankful for their help in convening those country groups to also provide input into the process of the claims guidance and the other work that we're doing, as well as in the coming month, we'll be putting together support from, or not support, feedback from various stakeholder groups, including civil society, and in businesses, in order to really be getting feedback into our work ahead. So based upon the work that we did in the summer, we came up with, or we developed from these various consultations, really 10 principles of VCMI: science-based action, comprehensive action, equity-oriented action, nature-positive action, rapid action, scaled-up action, transparent action, NDC-enabling action, consistent action, and 10, collective and predictable action. And again, you can find all this in our original consultation report. Overarchingly, our vision is that voluntary carbon markets will make a significant, measurable contribution to the transition of a global economy to that 1.5 C future, while promoting inclusive, sustainable development in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Back to you, Mark. Oh, I'm sorry. So the consultation report feedback, just briefly, some key takeaways. We have broad agreement with VCM's vision and principles, ample and desired opportunity for VCMI to lead and collaborate, as well as a key need, capacity building, and attention to equity, both from the demand and the supply side, as well as specific input on various issues.
Thank you very much, Lori. We now are going to be joined by Mark Kenber, who will provide an overview of the goals for VCMI moving forward.
Thank you very much, Mark. As has been mentioned a few times already, we have published the results of our consultation, which you will be publishing in the next few days, which you'll see, and that has fed into our roadmap of the VCMI's work between now and the end of April next year, which is, I suppose, the second phase after our inception phase that took place in the first part of this year. And we've got sort of 3 sets of very clear goals that will be converted into outputs at the end of April next year. First, as has been mentioned several times already, we're going to be publishing clear guidance on how non-state actors in general, but corporates in particular, should use make voluntary use of carbon credits in a way that is high integrity and high ambition. So many corporates, and I suspect some of those who are on the call today, but in the consultations we've had over the last few weeks, have said, one, we get told so many things about what we should and shouldn't do, when and how we should use them. We need some clear guidance. And where there is guidance, that guidance needs to be practical and operational. So our work, the report that we will be publishing in April next year, will attempt to fill both those gaps. One, a solid, comprehensive and consistent piece of guidance on how corporates should be using voluntary carbon credits and the claims they can make about them. And we're going to ensure that those are practical by working closely with potential users over the next 6 months to ensure that they are practical and operational and not just a nice brochure that sits on someone's shelf somewhere. Second bit of very important feedback we've had is going to that same issue, that it's not just producing another report on what claims should look like or what voluntary carbon market use should look like, but this needs to be backed up by an assurance mechanism or institutional governance framework that allows those claims to be verified and validated, that they can be tested, but equally importantly for those companies that do go above and beyond their own decarbonisation pathways and make use of voluntary carbon credits in a way that is high integrity, that is legitimate and is credible, that they are able to be distinguished from those who do not. And so therefore we'll be looking at what kind of possibly potentially regulation, or what kind of voluntary agreements, what kind of institutions are needed to provide assurance both to the users themselves, but the wider public on what those claims mean, what they're underpinned by, and why they are legitimate. And then the third piece of work that will be, third output by April next year will be, as has been mentioned already, access strategies for countries. And so Angela alluded to this in her initial remarks, that the voluntary carbon market is going to serve its public purpose of going above and beyond decarbonisation efforts, above and beyond policy, but also supports countries, in particular developing countries, in channeling finance to their NDCs. Host countries or potential host country governments need to be able to define where that finance needs to flow, where it's most useful, ensure that they're not just losing, for want of a better phrase, their low-hanging fruit and left with much more complicated and expensive options for their NDCs, so that voluntary carbon market financing is going where it's most needed, as defined by both the governments and the local communities in those countries. So we are working on access strategies with particularly with developing countries, but in all countries, so that that VCM, high integrity VCM finance flows where it's most needed. And cutting across all of that is the fourth part of this, which is making sure the voluntary carbon market supplements, complements, and adds on to the evolving international regulations. We all know that over the next 3 weeks, and we hope that there will be a resolution on the rules of the Article 6 mechanisms under the Paris Agreement. And in no circumstance should the voluntary carbon market be undermining that or seen as a low value, low integrity substitute. We need to make sure that the VCM complements, adds to, and that both sets of systems can learn from each other. And over time, we will see to what extent that they become part and parcel of the same system. Across all this work, this is about, we started VCMI as a multi-stakeholder process, and we will very much continue in that vein, as Laurie and others have already mentioned. The guidance we produce, the recommendations, will all be co-created. We have, as has been said, we have a steering committee and an expert advisory group that will be feeding in as we prepare these reports and these outputs, but they will be driven very much by the country contact group that we've already established, and similar engagement groups for the business community and civil society organizations, so that what comes out is co-owned and co-created by all the stakeholders, not just a few of us deciding to tell the world what it needs to do. And in that very same vein, we will be working closely with other initiatives. The VCMI is a very small part of a much broader ecosystem around carbon markets, about corporate accountability, about decarbonisation generally. We're just one part of that. And so we'll be working with other initiatives that are operating in the same space, where there are where they complement each other. And obviously examples of that would include the Voluntary Carbon Market Council, which is looking very much at the credit and transaction integrity, at the Science-Based Targets initiatives, and others looking at science-aligned pathways, defining what does a fair share of decarbonisation for corporates look like. And we will work together with them over the next 6 months and beyond as we all roll out our specific bits of guidance and policy. So on that note, I will now hand it over to Kelly Keziah, who is the chair of our expert advisory group, because one of the key things that we came out of the consultation and that we will be working on over the next 6 months are some thorny questions and issues that will need to be resolved before we can define what high integrity use or voluntary use of carbon credits looks like. So Kelly, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. And you've done a really good job setting me up. So I think I'm just going to present the drill down on these issues. So the priority issues we've identified are Paris Agreement and regulatory alignment. And you can see this includes issues such as complementarity and alignment with Paris Agreement architecture, including hopefully agreed guidance under Article 6. And then obviously there's a lot of links between Article 6 and the enhanced transparency framework. But we're also going to be looking at, interaction with domestic instruments and regulation, because we know that we need to be on a pathway where we're seeing more and more regulatory approaches to climate action. And we need to make sure that the voluntary carbon market is consistent with that. The second area is scope and purpose of claims. I think a lot of these issues will be familiar to people. And I can say we've definitely been ambitious in what we want to cover, and we hope to be able to get through it to provide that clarity and that very practical guidance that we know is a bit of a gap right now. So on scope and purpose of claims, we want to look at this interaction between scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and how those can be addressed. And then, the distinction between a reduction and a removal claim, and to ensure that whatever our advice is aligned with the science. And then I think a really important area is this alignment with net zero pathways, and the distinction, if there is any, between claims at the point of net zero around mid-century and claims on the pathway to net zero, to ensure that what we're doing is incentivizing more and more climate action rather than detracting from that. And then there's some sort of nuts and bolts areas that we've called accounting for voluntary use of carbon credits and transparency of claims. And this is, what should you report on these claims? What kind of infrastructure would be required? What level of detail should there be in that reporting? And how can we incorporate carbon credits into the, standard accounting protocols? And then finally, a really important area is the sustainable development and equity, where we're really going to try and look into these global equity and private sector VCM interaction and those issues, and issues related to IPLCs, Indigenous people and local communities. Thank you. And happy to have any questions on any of those.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And to the final slide, please, just a review of sort of the timing of all of this, and then we'll get into your questions. So in November, our expert advisory group will begin elaborating draft claims guidance. We'll be establishing the business and civil society IPLC engagement groups that have been discussed, and the country contact group will continue to meet. And we'll have an intensive work period, December through February, where we will be bringing issues to the contact and engagement group based on the work of the expert advisory group and the kind of input that is sought. And the preparation of VCM access strategies will continue. In February and March, we'll begin to finalize draft claims guidance, draft recommendations on governance and reassurance, and we'll have consultation again on actual draft guidance with contact and engagement groups and additional stakeholders. And we anticipate in April, we will publish the guidance, the recommendations on the insurance infrastructure and the access strategies. So thank you all for your kind attention to a great deal of information that's just been shared with you. We will begin to take some questions here, and I see we've got a question. First, we'll take Ed's question, and then we'll take Sajidin's question. Ed, go ahead.
Unmute. Hi, my question is a bit basic, but what is your definition of a carbon credit in simple terms?
Thank you. Turn that to Mark Kenber.
Thank you. So I think the VCMI doesn't have a specific definition of a carbon credit that's different from anybody else's, but I would say the carbon credit is a certificate that represents a ton of CO2 equivalent of emissions that have either been reduced, avoided, or removed from the environment. That's the simplest level. And to underpin what that credit is, for it to be real and meaningful, it needs to be come from a project that would not have happened without the existence of carbon finance. It needs to be permanent. It needs to be based on a credible baseline of what would have happened without the project. It mustn't be double counted, and a number of other sort of technical issues. But the sort of basic answer is it is a certificate that represents a ton of CO2 equivalent emissions reduced, avoided, or removed from the environment.
Thanks, Mark. And let's take Sajidin Hussein's question. Go ahead, Sajidin.
Yeah, my question was mainly on the difference between voluntary carbon market and the certified emission reduction markets. And I was not sure what are the other types of certified emission reduction markets which can be explored.
Mark, perhaps you'll take that one as well.
I'm happy to. I think Kelly can probably jump in and add to it. I mean, certified emission reductions is a specific type of carbon credit generated by projects under the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. And as you may well be aware, there's a debate at the moment, and which will come to a head in Glasgow in the next couple of weeks, as to what extent those certified emission reductions from the previous CDM can be used to meet future commitments and in future trading schemes. So where there's an overlap is there are some companies that, in making voluntary commitments around the use of carbon markets, have used certified emission reductions to meet those targets. And they could use either certified emission reductions, or they could use units that came from one of the 3 or 4 voluntary carbon market standards, such as the Verified Carbon Standard, the Gold Standard, and others. But they are separate types of units that come out of different frameworks. Kelly, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I was going to group it with Peter Miles' question, but I think it's a really good question, because I think the lines have become more blurred than they used to be. So it used to be that we had, units certified by government or groups of government, and Mark's given the example of the CDM, where it was a UN body that certified those credits, or you had credits generated by governments. And then separate to that, you had these voluntary standard setting bodies that would certify credits. And so that's how we used to distinguish between sort of compliance, government certified, or voluntary, certified by non-government organization standard setting bodies. Mark was actually part of setting up a couple of those, so he's really very familiar with those. But I think now the distinction has become more about the use rather than the generation, right? We've seen this flip. So now I think when we talk about voluntary credits, it's really credits being used towards voluntary goals. And compliance credits are now more credits being used for compliance purposes, to comply with regulation. So you have in California, they're using these voluntary standard setting bodies, but have specific credits that can be used for compliance purposes in the California ETS. The CORSIA, the carbon offsetting reduction scheme for international aviation also allows credits certified by voluntary standards to be used for those compliance obligations set by the UN for airlines. So I think that's really become the distinction. And then I was gonna, because Peter Miles asked about the voluntary standards, maybe that's a good lead on. But Mark, do you wanna?
Sure, Peter, may you, let's unmute you so you can ask your question.
Yeah,
Go
hi.
ahead, Peter.
Sorry, it takes a while to unmute there. So I was just asking what the relationship would be with the Vera, which Kelly's kind of addressed already, with Vera and the gold standard, as far as kind of certifying those results. And the only reason that I mentioned that is I was on a webinar about a month or so ago with the kind of corporate social responsibility from Amazon and from Shopify, and they both had budgets to forward purchase carbon credits to help developing companies, and I think that's unusual, it seems, at the moment. But I was very interested and surprised to hear that they didn't require that they were certified by either of the big registries. So maybe the question's been answered already, but it'd be good to clarify.
In general, my recommendation would be that you have credit certified by recognized standard setting bodies. I think we can certainly address that in the claims guidance. I'm looking to Mark and Angela, they're both nodding. I think we can definitely address that because you do see a lot of different certification functions, coming forward. We've already had a massive vetting through Corsia for all the programs that applied there, so we can draw upon that. And we have the major standard setting bodies represented on the EAG so that they can be part of that discussion. But Mark or Angela, I don't know if you want to pick up on that.
So we'll go to our next question from Nicola Peel. And maybe the panelists can let me know if you'd like to respond to this. Go ahead, Nicola.
Hello, yep, can you hear me there?
Yes.
Hi, Mark. Yes, I've been working in the Ecuadorian Amazon for 20 years. And of course, I've seen a huge amount of destruction over the 20 years I've been there. And a question that comes up a lot is that the small landowners and indigenous communities kind of feel left behind. And I talk to them about the carbon market and that one day they will get money to not have to cut the forest down. But with the meetings that I have, it seems like it's all focused on big business. And, it's like the little guy gets left behind again. And so I've been looking for an organization which is doing carbon offsetting and supporting those smaller landowners. And so I was wondering if you know of anybody in that way that we can move money to them so that they don't have to cut the forest down.
Are any of our panelists aware of such opportunities?
Not off the top of my head, Nicola, but I would be very happy. And just out by coincidence, I lived in Ecuador for 20 years and have half an Ecuadorian family. So I absolutely hear where you're coming from. So, but I'll happy to share my contact details with you, and I can put you in touch with a couple of organizations who I think might be able to help. It's certainly an area that I think across people working on voluntary carbon markets, this is what people are looking at, how to crowd in smaller scale projects that are, in particular, ones that directly are of benefit to Indigenous people and local communities. And I think that's going to be true of VCMI as it is of other initiatives such as the VCMC working in this space. But in terms of particular organizations, yeah, reach out to me, send me an email, or send me your contact details, put them in the chat, and I will reach out.
That would be fantastic. I'll be speaking at COP about it as well. And it just seems like it's such a no-brainer that we focus on the landowners, because although like BASE are really focusing on large-scale agribusiness, which of course is important too, all of the small landowners actually add up to more land. And so it seems to kind of be this oversight where so much money is being put into reforestation and tree planting, and rather than actually protecting what we already have. So yeah, if anybody can help with that, that would be great. Thank you.
May I ask Jamie Goldman to ask your question?
Hi, thank you for hosting this webinar and giving us a chance to ask questions. So my question is specific to, and maybe this one doesn't have an answer quite yet, but the aligning with the net zero pathways. There's a lot of variation around standards and initiatives as far as the role of carbon credits and removals to the path to net zero. And I'm just curious if you all have thought about how that fits in for your VCMI guidance. So, for example, SBTI standards have expressed carbon credits as additional to the pathway, so, beyond value chain, and have given very little guidance around types of removals that can be used for unabated emissions. And so I'm just curious where you all are heading with that.
Angela, might I direct that to you?
Thank you, and thank you, Jamie, for the question. This is a question that we are still looking at in the context of the VCMI. But one of the things, of course, that we are doing is drawing from different processes and trying to understand what different initiatives have done. From the vantage point of where I come from, which is the CPLC, we just finished some work with a number of stakeholders, and the sense was that, of course, as countries approaching net zero, the use of emission credits must necessarily decrease, and the use of any carbon credits in the pathway to zero have to be those that have a high quality and have the integrity so that they are really contributing to an effective reduction. However, as the closer we come to zero, the focus will then shift much more to more removal credits. And again, similarly in this context, looking for those that have a high credibility and a high impact. But as we say, this is a question that is still on the table. We are looking at how different initiatives have approached this, looking also at how to ensure leveraging the maximum potential of the voluntary market, but again, with a big focus on ensuring that that integrity is maintained throughout the process, regardless of what the final outcome is.
Thanks, Angela. Maybe this would be a good time to ask Kelly and Mark Kenber to address the question in the chat about the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets.
Well, let me take a start. As I think, is this the question from Chris or the comment from Chris in the chat?
Yes.
As he mentions, both Kelly and I, in slightly different guises, are on the board of the Voluntary Carbon Market Council, the successor to the TSVCM. Kelly is a representative of EDF as a founding sponsor, and I'm there as an independent member of the board of directors. And I think beyond that, both Kelly and I spent a lot of time over the summer working on some of the governance issues, which I personally believe are as relevant to the TSVCM, VCMC as they are to VCMI. Issues such as having complete transparency across the end-to-end of the value chain in the voluntary carbon market as a way of building credibility and trust in the market, systems for inclusive participation, and that goes to the questions about participation by indigenous groups and local communities and benefit sharing, so there's a real voice both in the project stage but also right through to the end of claims and how money is used. The VCMC is working on areas that are very complementary to what VCMI is doing, looking at what is a meta standard or an across the board standard, and this goes to the point about the gold standard and Vera and others. What is a standard that can apply across the board so all users know that a standard that meets the core carbon principles is of absolute high integrity, and therefore feel confident using it, and also integrity at the transaction level. And the VCMC and VCMI are separate but very complementary initiatives. And as you can see, because there's quite a lot of cross-pollination in terms of people, we certainly hope and expect that much of the guidance that comes out will be compatible, consistent and coherent and complement each other.
Yeah, I would disagree with that. I think we're all best served by ensuring that we're coherent and complementary. And I think I, for one, am very grateful to be involved in both initiatives, because we can, and actually in the net zero initiative that Angela spoke to, it's just all bringing us more information and bringing us closer to the kind of guidance and governance that we need. In TSVCM, obviously, like in my role as EAG co-chair, we're going to be looking a lot at the claims guidance. On TSVCM, what I'm most looking forward to is that sort of review of the methodologies that's being undertaken by some pretty impressive carbon market experts. And I'm really excited to see the results of that review and how we manage it in the board. So I think both really important pieces of work, and for all the reasons Mark said, also can be very, very complementary.
Thank you, Kelly and Mark. I'm going to read the next question, because there's some background noise that the asker, Tasneem, has indicated. So this will be, I think, directed to Angela first. How do you ensure no double counting? For example, an institution that generates greenhouse gas certificates and carbon credits. And two, will this voluntary carbon reduction projects eligible for credits always be relevant to developing markets only, or marginalized communities in developed markets as well?
To avoid double counting, what we really need are really clear and robust accounting rules to be able to track what is being generated where and what is being used elsewhere. So, of course, a conversation on the accounting is going to be extremely important. Secondly, on the, I'm looking for the second question. Will this be relevant only for developed markets or marginalized communities in developed markets as well? I would think it's relevant for both. We have seen some crediting projects happening also in developed countries where there has been, should I say, generation of credits with benefits to those communities. Of course, ideally, the demand for investments through the voluntary markets is biggest in developing countries, and we do hope that we will see quite a bit of attention being made in that regard as well.
Kelly or Mark, anything to add there?
Just that I think we really will be digging into some of these accounting system questions, and how all these accounting systems fit together is really important. And I think connected but separate, also how these projects and programs impact the local communities in the host country, and how the use of them impacts local communities near the buyers, and what kind of complementary policies and other measures we need to ensure are in place to make sure that we avoid negative impact, and that we, if possible, as Angela was saying, encourage positive impact and incentivize sustainable development.
Thanks, Kelly. I will, next question from Hannah, and maybe direct this one at Mark Kimber.
Yes.
You need to invite Hannah to say it, or should I just respond?
No, go ahead. I think she's live.
Can you hear me now, or?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, great. Okay, so maybe nicer to say it out loud than read it from the screen. So I'm working on the Nordic Dialogue on Voluntary Compensation, which is basically building knowledge on this very same issue at the Nordic level with Nordic non-state actors and also public sector. And a lot of it is knowledge building, but we're also aiming to co-create a Nordic code of best practice, obviously going to be a process rather than an end product. But we're wondering what would be the most valuable way in how a region could complement the VCMI. So if you have any ideas on that. And the second thing is that you seem to have a focus on the corporate side. Are you going to also consider, let's say, municipalities and cities or other types of organizations or very small organizations? Because that's where we actually have quite a lot of action here. But then the SBTI doesn't really apply. So those were my questions. Thank you.
So shall I start off on that? I think, Hannah, thanks for that question and also for the work that you're doing. I think we would absolutely want to ensure that any guidance around voluntary use of carbon credits and associated claims is consistent, and therefore I don't know whether you're going to be at COP or not, but we could meet there, or very happy to have a conversation before or after COP. And I think to the extent that we can pool knowledge, pool ideas, and end up with something that is coherent and consistent for all potential users, that would be a great outcome. And one of the reasons VCMI was established was because in our consultations, people from all sectors said to us, we don't know, as I said in my presentation, we don't quite know which standard to follow, how we should define our claims, and we want to have something that is based on broad support from all constituencies, provides that coherence. In terms of whether it's just corporates, I think I've mentioned corporates in particular because that's where a lot of the demand for our work comes from. But this is not exclusive to corporates. And in the roadmap, I think, and in other documents, we've referred to non-state actors more generally. And we would hope that our guidance, can be used by all non-state actors who are using in some way, making voluntary use of carbon credits in some way to meet their climate targets. I'm not knowledgeable enough on the municipal level about municipalities and how they set their science-based targets. As I think you said in your question, the SBTI doesn't deal with that, but maybe Kelly or Angela, you know of others and how we might be incorporating guidance for non-corporate NSAs into our work.
Angela or Kelly, would you like to add about the non-corporates?
I'm hoping that there's an extent to which our guidance is universal, about the kind of claims, but I do think that when it comes to government-esque, so these municipalities and cities, the accounting questions that we've just been talking about are probably more even in focus than otherwise. So Hannah, I would love to talk to you further about that at the COP. So there's a large extent to which, we hope that the claims guidance will be universal for those that want to use credits for voluntary purposes. But there's probably some ways that we have to consider how sort of cities and how they're accounting for this fits into the broader national objectives and progression in terms of ambition and scope. That's the only way I can think that we might have to cater. Other than that, I think it should be broadly applicable.
Right, thank you. We have a question from Jose. Please, can we unmute Jose? Jose, go ahead. I will read Jose's question. Many companies, and particularly those in the oil and gas sector, are using the voluntary markets to make misleading product claims, such as carbon neutral markets. How is VCMI planning to tackle that? Kelly, maybe you'll start us off.
Yeah, I think that's, claims for sold products is definitely a particular area and a particular area of concern, as we've seen from different court cases and things. So I think we need to tackle that. That's it's a little bit distinct from how companies are using carbon credits to claim something about their own climate goals. Rather, in this case, they're sort of passing them on to what their customers can claim about their climate goals. And I think that makes it a little bit different, both in terms of accounting and in the nature of the claim. So I think we will need to take that on. I don't think we have yet, so I wouldn't have a statement on that yet, but I think that it's an important point and one that we probably need to take on. It's also connected, that's why I want to look to Mark Kember. I think because of that government link and the false and misleading advertising, the kind of claims you can make and the involvement we've seen in governments already, I think it's part of that broader governance question, which is where we want to take the VCMI over time.
Kelly, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, just to go, without distinguishing between products or companies, what the VCMI is here for is to provide very robust guidance on the claims that can be credibly made and a means of distinguishing those from those that are made without credibility. And I'm not going to make some comments on specific sectors, but I suspect there are companies across all sectors who are really going the extra mile to decarbonize across all three scopes of their footprint, and are then looking only to use the voluntary carbon market to go above and beyond. And there are others who I suspect are thinking, well, if carbon credits are cheap, we'll use that and we'll do nothing. And our guidance will absolutely exclude the latter group, and will focus very much on providing robust guidance and support for that former group who really are decarbonizing and using voluntary carbon markets to go above and beyond and support the Paris Agreement. And I think it's a very good point on products, and it's something that we will look at over the next 6 months. And I think one of the big questions is, well, to my personal opinion, without prejudging the outcome, is that a product with a credible environmental claim can only come from a corporate that already has a credible environmental claim in the first place. But that's for us to be just discussing over the next 6 months.
Thank you, Mark. Anything else on the greenwashing issue? So Ed, I think you were the first question. Let's go back to Ed. You've put a couple of other questions into the pot here. Go ahead, Ed.
Okay. I run a small charity, a local charity in the UK, and we've got this massive change in agriculture, and there is the opportunity for farmers and landowners to run projects that offset carbon and also look at biodiversity net gain as well within our system. But nobody is taking that on. So the concept we're pursuing is that there is a local carbon market where local businesses offset carbon in local projects, and that engenders ownership. It means the monitoring and compliance is comparatively easy, but we've got the issue of how do we certify the carbon that's being offset. So do you think a small local organisation that's well run will be able to have a certification regime for their local market at in these early stages, or is that not going to be viable? If that makes sense.
We're all looking at each other a bit here. I mean, yeah. I think that the challenge is that, the way you framed it, it's absolutely obvious that we would like to have something that enables, and this goes back to the question that Nicola asked earlier about groups in the Ecuadorian Amazon. How do you enable certification and validation, auditing of projects that are small, probably where those transaction costs become so high that it's difficult for the project to go ahead if it's using a large international validation or verification body. But at the same time, you need to balance that with, for numerous reasons, ensuring that the projects and the credits are independently verified to meet the standards of highest integrity. And in the middle of that is, as I said, the cost. And so I think that's something that I know that the different voluntary carbon standards are looking at. The TSVCM will be looking at it. It is looking at in terms of transactions and costs associated with them. But I think, as we all know, one of the reasons that we're here talking about high integrity, whether it be on the supply or the demand or any other part of the system, is because one of the problems that the market has had is a lack of trust, because it hasn't been transparent, because people have felt, justifiably or not, that some projects haven't met the grade, haven't been truly additional, haven't generated the additional benefits they should have done, and therefore there's strong requirements for independent third-party verification free and prior informed consent by local stakeholders, which in your case, I think is integral to the project. But it is something that is a challenge across the voluntary carbon market. In fact, across carbon markets in general, the smaller local projects. It may be that if you're not looking to be part of the sort of the formal, so to speak, voluntary carbon system, that this is just an internal transaction within a jurisdiction, within your community in the UK, and there doesn't need to be any particular claim linked to an international registry because it doesn't affect the UK's overall carbon accounts. It's within the same country. But I mean, again, I think Kelly, you probably know more about this than I do.
I think you've covered it. I mean, the CDM, for instance, had different standards for small scale projects in order to encourage small scale projects. I'm not sure that it was, I think all of the standard setting bodies do this, but I do know that we face sort of a barrier to entry because of the cost, and then we face high transaction costs that can sometimes mean that the small guys are out. I think we've also had pointed out in the chat that technology is going to start to help that, in terms of monitoring and reporting. What I can say is even the U.S. Department of Agriculture is struggling with some of these questions. We were just part of a consultation period where they're trying to figure out how to get the smaller farmers involved because the transaction costs tend to be so high. So I think it's a really live and important question, and one that we do collectively need to tackle, right? We need to make sure that there aren't such high, that the costs associated with entry into the market and the transaction costs aren't so high that they exclude really important and community-based activities, while at the same time striking that balance that Mark was talking about in terms of ensuring that we have enough governance, enough checking, enough scrutiny of these things to make sure that really are high quality. I'm sorry, I know that's a walk around, but just to let you know, you're not alone in trying to figure out this problem. There are a lot of people struggling with that exact question.
Thanks, Kelly. Yes, and some good resources identified in the chat response to that. Let me read Rosa's question and direct that to Angela. Would the VCMI provide guidance and recommendations on the interactions of voluntary carbon markets with other voluntary and mandatory natural capital markets? For example, how the UK voluntary woodland carbon code interacts with biodiversity net gain?
Excuse me. Thanks, Rosa, for the question. And I see also Chris Waterfield has provided further information on the woodland carbon code. To the extent possible, we will be looking at the interaction between the different markets and how this, of course, affects the integrity of the claims that could be made depending on where they would also be utilized. But definitely this is a question that we will have on the table, and then we'll see what comes out of the consideration of the EAG.
Anything else on that from our other panelists? Okay, I think that we have addressed all of the questions with the exception of one, which is how to participate moving forward. And so I will encourage you all, we'll put the link to the form again here in the chat. So we've got a form. We'd like you to identify sort of which issues you're most interested in, and then we offer a few different ways in which we may be engaging people moving forward, and depending on the issue, and you can identify the ones you're most interested in. They include occasional roundtables to discuss and provide input on specific issues, opportunities to comment in writing on draft VCMI guidance, serving on one of the engagement groups, a small diverse engagement group that would have more regular and intensive engagement with VCMI, or other suggestions you might have about how you might like to be engaged. I want to thank everybody for your time and attention, your very good questions. Certainly, your questions will be helpful to us in our work as we move forward. And just want to wish those of you who are traveling to Glasgow for the COP safe travels and much success in achieving the outcomes on which the stability of our climate, the health and well-being of all of our people here on Earth, and the vitality of our ecosystems depend. Is there anything else anyone would like to add from our panel?
Just a great thank you for being here today.
Yes, I was going to say the same, and please do fill in the form and do get engaged, get involved with us. And as I said, we're looking to have something, produce outputs that are co-created and that really count on support from a whole wide range of stakeholders that are involved in voluntary carbon markets. So please fill in that form, get in touch. For those of you who ask specific questions of me, I put my email in the chat box. There's a lot of chat, so you may have to scroll up and down to find it, but please do get in touch. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. And as we said, the success of the VCMI really depends on a broad participation of stakeholders. And we really hope that we can continue counting on you to share with us questions, views, documents, things that will help us enrich the work of the VCMI. Thanks.
Thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Be well.